Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, there were some stormy exchanges in the Commons last night over the scheduling of business in the House. The Commons leader, Andrea Leadsom, faced pressure over the debates that have been scheduled since the election. So there was a debate about, well, debates. Let's take a look.
Mr. Speaker, we need certainty. The government has not provided for an opposition day before the summer recess, making the earliest opposition day in September 2017. This means a staggering 8 months, nearly as long a time as it takes to have a baby, without a single opposition day, denying vital scrutiny of government business, with the last opposition day, as you know, Mr. Speaker, on the 25th of January.
Last week, we had a vital debate on the Grenfell inquiry. Many powerful points were raised from members on all sides of the House, and it's right that we've prioritised giving time to such a catastrophic and tragic event. This week, we're having a general debate on what more can be done to eradicate the evil of drug misuse. And today, although now under threat by this debate, we're scheduled to have a debate on the intimidation and abuse of candidates in the general election. Mr. Speaker, this urgent debate is the result of party politics at its worst. Nearly 13 million people voted for the party opposite to come to this place and represent them. I don't believe they were voting for petty time-wasting by Labour.
Perhaps unfavourably, this Parliament has already been dubbed the zombie Parliament. But I actually think that that comparison would actually give the flesh-eating undead a bad name. This is turbocharged political zombieism. But it's a curious type of zombieism, Mr. Speaker, because if you look at them, not only are they tearing the flesh from the public, they're starting to consume themselves.
If the government had a programme, I'd be happy for us to debate the government's programme. But there isn't any legislation. The Leader of the House refers to the Air Travel Organisers Licensing Bill. That isn't a bill. That's barely a clause in a bill.
That's where I think the opposition has today misfired to everything. There is a season and a time to any purpose under heaven. But this was not the season. This was not the time. There is so much that is going on of general urgency, and this strikes me as fiddling whilst Brussels burns.
Passions running high in the Commons there. Now, during the general election, the Labour Party announced their support for a so-called Robin Hood tax, or a financial transactions tax. This, they said, would raise £26 billion over 5 years. Here's Shadow Business Secretary Rebecca Long-Bailey explaining the policy to Andrew on the Sunday Politics at the time.
This isn't a new initiative. There's a growing global pressure to ensure that we have fairness in our financial sector, and ordinary British people are still paying for a banking crisis that they didn't cause. So the aim of this tax is to restore fairness in the system. Another important point is the fact that stamp duty reserve tax was actually brought in the 1600s. Now, there have been little reforms over the years, but certainly the sector has changed significantly, and we have to provide changes to the system for that change. And I mean, I name high-frequency trading, where we have a state of affairs where a lot of our shares are traded on computers within milliseconds now. Sure. We have to ensure that we have a tax system that keeps up with that.
Rebecca Long-Bailey. Well, this afternoon, John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor, is hosting an event where one of his speakers will be Avinash Persaud, Chairman of Intelligence Capital and a former global head of currency research at JP Morgan. His report on a financial transaction tax formed the basis for the Labour policy, and Avinash joins us now. Welcome to the Daily Politics.
Thanks, Jo.
Stamp duty is already 0.5% on shares. Are you suggesting that figure should be raised, or it should apply to more financial products?
not raised. There are two problems with that number. Firstly, we have a market maker exemption that's being abused. Traditionally, market making, which is a very important activity, used to be about 10 or 15% of trading on the exchange. It's now become over 50 towards 60%. And that's really because other people who are not really market makers, like hedge funds and high-frequency traders, are saying that they will be there. But of course, when the crisis comes, they're not there for the marketplace. So we need to end the market maker abuse. And we also need to extend the securities from equities towards debt as well, because the tax system has long favoured debt versus equities. And we need to include derivatives.
Right. But if you look at the figures, at the amount that it would raise, Labour said £26 billion over 5 years. Currently, stamp duty reserve tax, the tax on buying shares, raised £3.3 billion a year in 2015 to 16. So even if you extended that and you close the loopholes or you remove the exemptions and you put it on derivatives, would it really raise £26 billion over 5 years?
It's actually a very conservative estimate. If we assumed that raising a tax would have no impact on behaviour, you'd raise £65 billion. But of course, we all know that raising taxes incentivizes people to try and, do we really need to do this? Can we change the timing or whatever? So we've taken into account a very conservative view as how much behaviour will change. And that's where you get to 26. Without behaviour changes, it's 65 billion.
But even John McDonnell said it was a gamble, that you couldn't rely on those figures. I take your point that you think it's a cautious estimate. It still sounds like a big amount of money to be raised in an area where people are very mobile, potentially, and where people could, as you say, either leave or set up somewhere else, and that would then mean you would net far less.
There's a lot of confusion, deliberate confusion, about relocation. This is a tax designed for there to be no relocation. If you're an American investor today and you're trading a French stock or an Australian stock in London, you don't pay stamp duty, and you won't pay stamp duty in the future because you're an American, not a British resident, and you're trading a non-UK instrument. So there's no incentive to relocate your trade. If you're a British citizen and you're trading in Frankfurt or Hong Kong, you're still liable for income tax and capital gains tax, and you're still liable for taxes on UK instruments.
Are you in favour of a financial transactions tax?
Well, I'm certainly not going to get into the British tax system, except to say this, that one of the reasons why a lot of Australian companies use the City of London is because it not only has the skill set and very strong legal protections, but because it's a competitive market to use. So when you look at these kind of arguments, you might like to take into account the alternatives. So we could use Singapore, we can of course use Sydney, New York and so on. If you make London less competitive, inevitably that's going to have some impact on the amount of business that's done through London, but I won't get into
well, then it's going to damage the city.
No, because if you're an Australian,
if
you're an Australian doing business around the world in London, and you're trading, say, American securities, etc., you don't pay stamp duty. And that's a very important point. This is not a tax on where you trade. This is a tax on who is trading and what they're trading. A very important distinction. You will not be able to avoid the tax simply by moving.
But could it be done unilaterally in that sense? I mean, if you don't get some sort of international cooperation, and we know that the EU has talked about this, and they are still doing. They haven't agreed anything. France was supposed to be the sort of lead nation on this, and Emmanuel Macron is apparently showing no sign of making this a priority. You leave the city vulnerable.
So, second biggest myth. First biggest myth is relocation.
Right.
Second biggest, we've had the tax unilaterally for 322 years. A fair amount of time for the wise people in the city to innovate,
right.
And for other countries to lure business away from London. It hasn't happened. In the G20 report, the IMF report to the G20, they found there were 20 countries that had unilateral FTTs, raising $30 billion a year already, including, Joe, the fastest growing countries. India has one, Hong Kong has one, Taiwan has one, Singapore has one.
Right. Do you think it is a myth that actually it has always been something used by politicians and businesses alike to say, if you impose a tax and make us, in your words, less competitive, then we will relocate, but there's no evidence to show it's happened, or that we'll make different choices?
I mean, it doesn't matter what tax was introduced 300 years ago. That's irrelevant, because the City of London has grown in that period in spite of it, not because of the tax. The overall picture is one of, if you want the City of London to remain the world's greatest financial centre and you think that's virtuous for your economy, I mean, I suppose some people in Britain don't think that's a good idea. But if you think that is a good idea, however you tax the system, I'm not getting into that, you need to keep it reasonably competitive. That would be the only point. And if you don't make it competitive, if you decide, I mean, look, people are reasonably might decide they don't want the country to make huge amounts of money out of financial transactions. So if you want to do something else as a country, fair enough, but people will move to other parts of the world in those circumstances.
Competitiveness is a very important point, and in our post-Brexit environment, having competitive industry is going to be vital.
Financial services being extremely important.
Germany, a very competitive economy, and if you ask German industry what makes them competitive, they'll say long-term finance. They have access to long-term finance. Our financial sector is obsessed with the short term, not lending to industry. And so this tax will rebalance our financial sector and make it more fit for purpose, more lending for industry to be competitive, to export and import.
Why have you not been able to persuade, I mean, George Osborne obviously thought it was a very bad idea, the former Chancellor, and Sadiq Khan, the current Labour Mayor, says it's madness.
He was referring to a previous idea some 12 months ago, not this tax.
What was the idea that he was referring to?
He was referring in general to financial transaction taxes, not this design which deliberately avoids relocation.
And what's his view on that then? Has he said anything about this particular idea?
I haven't seen anything.
Right. But, I mean, he is, of course, running London, and he does say that any taxes that might damage the City of London, in his view, would be madness. So how are you going to persuade him?
I think that, the key thing to remember is that this tax will actually increase the stability of our financial sector. We have seen a big increase in flash crashes, Joe, ever since we've seen an increase in high-frequency trading. I think the way we make our financial sector more resilient, more stable, more attractive is if it doesn't have these flash crashes.
OK, thank you very much for coming in.